This is the Kevin Smith Show on Global Star Communications Network.
And good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be all around the earth, whoever you happen to be. Thanks for joining us here at the Kevin Smith Show. If it's your very first time to listen to the show, a special welcome to you. I'm delighted you're here, and I hope you make a habit out of this. It's a good habit to get into. It really, really is. We get email, lots of email, and I really enjoy reading it. I'm not joking, folks. I'm telling you the truth. I read all of the email that comes in. I respond to as much of it as I can, and I want you to know that I do appreciate it. I do find it very interesting and stimulating and sometimes very educating. And I want to give you our email address. Some of you know, and you write to me frequently. That's a good thing. Some of you don't know our email address, and I want to give it to you. It is host@kevinsmithshow.com, and in the subject line put the words listener comment, okay? And if you forget all of that, look, the easy way to do it, go over to the website, kevinsmithshow.com. And when you're there on the website, just click where it says Contact Us, and it'll bring up a page. It'll take care of all of the addressing and everything for you, okay? So send me an email. Let me know that you're listening and what you think. You like it, you don't like it, you want someone specific to be invited to be a guest. I do pay attention to those. And many of you know that you have suggested guests, and that, I can't get them like tomorrow because there's some scheduling to work out with them, but we do get them. My guest tonight, as a matter of fact, is someone who was suggested to me by one of you, our listeners. So send me that email, okay? While you're over there at the Kevin Smith Show website, be sure, if you have not already subscribed to the K-Files e-zine, that's our free weekly newsletter. Be sure you do that. It's free and only takes about 20 seconds to subscribe, and then you will not be the only person who does not know. That's a good thing, huh? All right. My guest tonight is going to be Alan Watt. Alan Watt has questioned standard versions of history and has delved into ancient civilizations and the occult groups which managed them. Since 1998, Alan has come forward to share his knowledge, beginning with the Sweet Liberty radio program on international shortwave. This shortwave broadcast ended in 2005, but he continues broadcasting on First Amendment Internet Radio every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And he's going to join us here in just a couple of minutes after we come back from our first break. And we're going to be talking with him tonight about the influence of these occult groups from ancient times. We'll be talking about how they managed the ancient civilizations and to what end, and what impact perhaps that has in our day and upon our lives. Again, that's Alan Watt, and he's got a website called Cutting Through the Matrix, and you want to be sure and check that out as well, okay? So go on over to kevinsmithshow.com and sign up for the K-Files e-zine and send me an email too. By the way, while you're there, sign our guest book. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Kevin Smith Show. My guest this evening, as I told you, is Alan Watt. And Alan has just finished. I want to tell you, I really appreciate what he's doing. He has just finished another interview and went right straight from that here to talk with you. So, Alan, thank you and welcome to the Kevin Smith Show.
It's a pleasure.
Alan, you have kind of a... I don't want to say it's a strange view of the world. It's not that it's strange, but it's that you have a view that is different from the mainstream, and it's quite a bit different. And one of the things that I noticed, I listened to an interview that you had on Coast to Coast, and one of the things that I noticed is that, you know, this thought came to my mind. You can be in a situation where, and people certainly have been in a situation like this in various places around the world, where you don't see anything, but and maybe you don't smell anything, but all of a sudden your body begins to react to something that's in the air, poison gas, for instance. And so, you know, at first you start saying, well, you know, I can't see, my vision is blurred, and then, well, I feel funny, and then, you know, but still you don't see and you don't smell anything, you didn't hear anything, but it starts to have an effect on you. And a lot of people around the world right now are sort of in that situation. They really don't see something, and they haven't heard, and they don't smell anything, but lots of people are beginning to sense something's up.
Oh, yes.
And
yeah, something definitely is up. It's almost a hush before the storm. There's a hush of expectation. And there's been such a hype, mind you, of I call it terror creation in the people's minds to get them into something so that they will react and go the way they're planned to go. That's generally why fear and terror is used from the top down. That's a standard down through the ages. It brings into mind, actually, Professor Carroll Quigley, who was the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. And he was in the record-keeping department, or histories, and he was updating their histories for them and filing them. And from that, he wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment. And he talks about how the Council on Foreign Relations, the British set, in British Commonwealth countries, they're called Institutes of International Affairs. And every Commonwealth country, including Canada, has one. Non-Commonwealth countries have Council on Foreign Relations. India has one too, and Pakistan. And he talks about how the government hyped up the British public for 3 or 4 years prior to World War II to get them all sort of ready for the war. And they had board meetings with the big newspaper corporations of London, who were all members of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they agreed to panic the people by putting out false data, propaganda, on an increasing drumbeat right up for 2 or 3 years on the go. And they told them nothing but lies. And Quigley, who has the records, talks about this being discussed at the round tables in London with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they agreed to constantly tell the people in all the newspapers that Hitler had all this gas ready to gas everybody in Britain. And they had, millions of tons of it. And sure enough, they gave everybody a gas mask, and children had them, and they had practice rehearsals in school and putting them on, something like it did during the Cold War. Children get under the table. It was to keep it fresh in your memory. And then of course they even asked King George to make a speech to the public, to tell them to start digging trenches in major cities. This is so it would seem more visual to them. The trenches would be of no use at all, of course, in an air raid. But they kept up this hype and fear, and they even started evacuating children up into Scotland from the major cities. And again, at that time, the war was still 3 years away. And it split the families up. It made it seem all so real, so that by the time, with all this hype, you're going to get gassed at any minute, when they eventually said we're going to war with Germany, the people who were so tensed up and panicked breathed a sigh of relief. Yeah, and that is how psychological warfare works on entire populations.
This isn't something new, though, is it?
Pardon?
This is not something new, though, is it?
It's a standard technique.
Been going on actually for millennia.
Oh yes, uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now that's something that I really was interested in as I was listening to your interview, and also I went to your website and I read some things you have on your website. It's called Cutting Through the Matrix, right?
Mm-hmm.
CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. But what really kind of piqued my interest was the fact that this is not new. It's been going on for millennia. And you talk about how the ancient civilizations were manipulated by occult managers.
Oh, yeah.
And can you kind of take us back in time and give us a little bit of a history lesson about that? What do you mean when you say that they were managed by these occult people?
Well, I think the masters of it, who left more records of the techniques, were the Egyptians and the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And Egypt took every pharaoh, for instance, and trained him in the art of government, the sciences of government, they called it, and to the mysteries of government. These were the hidden sciences of basically human mass psychology. And interestingly enough, later the Greek nobility, such as Plato and Democritus and all the big boys, Socrates, Pythagoras, they all were sent to Egypt to enter the mysteries. It would take them 22 years there generally to learn all the mysteries. And then they were sent back to their own countries. Sometimes they had to move on. Plato went to the mysteries there. He was then sent to the mystery school in Palestine, and then to one in India, and then back to Greece. So this is a lot of learning.
And what was the purpose for that?
Well, what they learned, when you look at what came out of Egypt, was revolution. Because from the days of even Pythagoras, who studied there, and he was sent back to the Grecian colonies. Now, they had a big empire at that time, and he was sent to Crotona, where he set up a mystery school, the standard mystery school. These mystery schools had so much in common with the later Catholic monasteries. It's quite amazing. Because, and you see it 2,000 years ago in Palestine, where the Essenes were. They're all the same, really, like techniques. Pythagoras would recruit young aristocratic students. He actually took in male and female, separate quarters, of course, but they had 5 years of silence. That was standard. And they had to watch, look, and listen. And eventually some of them were picked to go higher. Some of the young ladies were trained in with a tremendous education to be good marriageable partners for the nobility. And then they were basically taken out and introduced to higher members of existing powers, existing establishments. And the whole idea was to start swaying decisions made in those governments. And when this was found out, what it was really all about, a form of revolution, they turned on Pythagoras and burned down his school and chased him off, and it's undecided whether he was killed or not. But that was the same thing that happened ultimately to Socrates. Now, Socrates, who'd also been trained in Egypt and said a lot of wise things, as they all have very wise sayings, he was accused of corrupting the youth. And what they really meant was he was doing the same thing as Pythagoras. He was recruiting young nobility and training them in a new way of living. You might call it a new world order of the time. And train them up to revolutionaries, and also to enter governments and take over those governments, and then take a particular agenda forward, which was to create wars upon other countries and take them over one by one into world empire.
Well, who was behind that? I mean, you've got Socrates and Pythagoras and Plato and all those guys being sent to these to study these mysteries. Who is behind it? Who sent them?
They were sent by the masters back in Egypt. Egypt exported revolution. That's what exported. And all the ones who came there to be initiated were being trained to go back to their former countries, set up these schools in preparation for revolution. And Plato wrote about it. And Plato actually was chased off too. He disappeared for years after his teacher Socrates had to drink the hemlock. And so he disappeared and eventually came back and repented and started up his school, but he was no sooner there than he was starting the same old thing all over again. And Plato wrote the book called The Republic.
Right.
And The Republic, of course, was about a future utopia to come. A utopia where an intelligentsia, they called it a natural aristocracy, would rule. Almost a scientific system. But at the top of them would be the guardians, a guardian class, the guardians of the world, and the guardians of the system. And Plato said, he said, you know, man is infinitely malleable. He can adapt to anything so quickly. And because of that ability, man could be made to adapt to a series of adaptations leading to a perfect new type of creature. And he said, we already have domesticated animals for thousands of years. And if we want a small domesticated dog, he says, we create one by selective breeding. If we want the same thing to get a big dog, we again select the dogs, interbreed them until we get the perfect dog. He said humans are the same. We can do the same with humans and create really tall, long ones if we wanted people to pick apples, or short, not too bright ones who wouldn't, because we don't want people to rebel, of course. So we make short ones for mining and doing all the heavy work and labor. And when you realize what he was talking about with his science, that he was not inventing or discovering, he was simply repeating what they already knew in Egypt for thousands of years and had been doing.
What's interesting about what you're saying here is that it sounds very much like what the ancient Sumerians said about the Anunnaki. Are you familiar with that?
Not really. The Anunnaki has nothing to do with what people have recently been flooded with.
Well, what they said was the Anunnaki did genetic engineering for the purpose of creating a race to do gold mining and to do the hard labor.
Mm-hmm.
And
but that really is a spin, a big spin, on an interpretation that only one man ever took, and it's his own interpretation which doesn't stand up with other experts on linguistics.
So you don't think that this finds its origins in...
No, and I'll tell you why.
Sumerian.
I mean, Anu in Babylonian and in Sumerian and in Egyptian, Anu, and it's still taught today in the higher mystery schools, Anu was always a spirit. It's the Anu who guides you through the Book of the Dead, through the underworld. It's the Anu who does it. You call up the Anu, and every doorway in Freemasonry has its Anu and its passwords. It's the same thing. And
so
the whole
it's not a literal being then?
No. In fact, the Sumerians had the exact same story, really, as the Egyptians, where earth met sky, and out of sky came Uranus and so on, different gods. And these had nothing to do with real people. When you look at kingships and the system, they will always give you a hierarchy of mortal beings, modeled after a heavenly body sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So you have the multitude of the stars, that's the holy host, is the multitude of stars, and then you have your main ones, the planets, and those are sections or hierarchies of priesthoods which deal with specific things coming downwards in a V shape, an upside down pyramid, to meet on the earth plane. Then you have the upgoing pyramid meeting at the apex, and that's where the king is. And then you have the descending order of nobility, courtiers, military, all the way down to the masses who are again the earthly host. This is so they always justified it with what they call foundation myths, and that's how they justified their control system.
Now,
that was standard.
In that model, do we still have groups that are promoting that model?
Oh yes, it's still the same today. I can remember watching, when I was small, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And it was astounding to watch, because this was held in Westminster Abbey, an old middle-aged cathedral. And in Westminster Abbey you have tombs of knights, of the Norman knights that came in about the 11th century. And the Norman nobility are still the nobility today all over Europe. And near where the Queen was being coronated, there's a couple of a man and his wife. He's dressed up as a knight, laying flat, of course, on top of the sarcophagus. And next to him, on the whole wall, from the floor to the ceiling, you'll see a chessboard, which is a tessellated floor of Freemasonry, on the wall. And next, on either side of it, there's an obelisk, an Egyptian obelisk. And then there's 3 tiers. There's 2 tiers above that with another 4 obelisks, Egyptian obelisks above that. And this is inside a supposed Christian church. And then when the Queen was being coronated, she's raised up on a raised dais, like a ziggurat, is a step pyramid. And her throne is there. And then you have all these lords, all the nobility and cousins and relatives. And the lords wear traditionally a red outfit. It used to be a kind of gown with an ermine collar on it. Ermine is the symbol of royalty in Britain and in Europe. Now the ermine fur you'll see on the depictions going as far back as Nimrod. Nimrod wore the same thing, ermine fur, with a red outfit. And so you're watching this being reenacted thousands and thousands of years later in Westminster Abbey, and then the Queen is handed the same symbols, the scepter, and the staff. And the guy in front of her, he holds the crook, the archbishop. And of course you see in the Egyptian petroglyphs, you'll see and on your coffins, you'll see that the Pharaoh has his arms crossed, and he holds the rod in one hand, which is really a mace, and on the other hand is the small staff. And that's the staff or the crook of the shepherd. He was the good shepherd, because all these leaders down through history were called good shepherds. And what you did was cajole the sheep to come this way by pulling them with the hooked end of the crook. And if they didn't come, you hit them with the staff. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. That's in the Old Testament. So here's this odd thing that was used 5000 BC, being reenacted in Westminster Cathedral in the 20th century. And everybody who was present stood exactly in the right positions, as you'll see on the various carvings of Nimrod being inaugurated. And no one asks why. Why?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to ask why, but we're headed into a break, and we'll hold that thought for when we come back from the break. But very quickly, let me ask you this. Isn't it true that in the ancient world, in the ancient civilizations, the religion was divided? There was one religion for the nobility, the elite, and another for the peons.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. When we come back from this break, I'd like to get into that. I'd like for you to explain the why of the symbolism and everyone standing in their correct place, and also why 2 religions, and does that still exist? So if you'll ponder that for a bit, we'll get you to answer that for us when we come back. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest is Alan Watt. We will open the telephone line for you later. You want to be sure to stay tuned and hear what's coming up. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show. And my guest is Alan Watt. Alan, before we went to break, you were talking about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and everybody standing in their proper place, just as it had been in antiquity. And you said, and nobody stops to ask why. So what is the answer to that? Why?
They don't ask, actually, because the public asks very little, unfortunately. Some children might ask the whys, and the parents can't give them the answers because they don't know how old this tradition is. They assume that it's simply a Middle-Age Norman creation, and they don't know the tie-ins to the ancient Babylonian, Sumerian-type system. But once you've studied them, it's so apparent. And I have been in Westminster Cathedral too and looked at these incredible, the knights there with, as I say, the Egyptian obelisks inside this Christian cathedral. And then, of course, you're onto a hunt just to find out why they're there, and to find out more about these Normans that brought that system with them. Who were the Normans, for instance, to bring in Egyptian obelisks into a place like England. And, of course, there's so much more behind the Normans than meets the eye.
Well, what was the reason that they brought in an Egyptian system?
Well, the Normans are strange people who just sort of popped up in the north of France and supposedly had a connection with the Scandinavian countries, and used the Scandinavian countries to come down into England from, at least from one direction, while they had an onslaught through Europe, taking over Europe, on the scale of, bigger than the scale of World War II, actually, with logistical supply lines going right back to their little country in France. They had huge forts built, massive forts, pre-built, prefabricated, and they towed them across the English Channel and assembled them, hundreds of these things. And so the supply lines stretched all the way back to the north of France, and no one's ever said, where did all this money come from? To hire tens of thousands of workers, to hire such massive armies, while the nobility themselves, the Norman nobility, came in with all of these strange Middle Eastern coats of arms. It's never been discussed by the historians as to why. Where did all this backing come from? Where did the expertise come from to begin a war like that, knowing where it wanted to go, and having the financial backing and the military logistical expertise to carry it out?
Have you been able to determine? Have you been able to determine where it came from?
Well, yeah, I think in part ways. When you look at the standards that they had for nobility, now most people would say, well, they copied the standards around the times of the Crusades, but we're talking about just before the Crusades came in. The Normans came in with these banners that owned family crests. We see some of them up around the Black Sea area prior to that, where people lived, and a nobility lived. Herodotus mentions them in his writings around 300 BC. And later on, we see them coming to prominence and being called the Khazars by a man who wrote the 13th tribe, after Kessler or Kostler. And he goes into the history of the 13th tribe. They adopted Judaism around the 7th century AD. But there was two groups of them. One of them, the public seldom saw. They were called the Kagans. They were the nobility of this group. And it's possible that these were actually a people, a nobility that came out of Egypt itself. and very possibly around the time of Akhenaten. And because the only symbol that the Khazars had, according to Maimonides, who's one of the top historians of the era, he lived in Spain, and he helped bring Judaism to them when the king asked. But he said that the Khazars, or the Kagans, the kings, were of a red or blonde complexion, and they had blue or green eyes. And they did not mix with the rest of the people, the ordinary people around them. But they had these same types of standards that we eventually became known in Normandy, in the Norman country, and then came into England with. So there's definitely a tie-in there. And they were very powerful people, very, very powerful people. They'd helped the Christian church many times. In fact, they saved the Vatican when the Moors were sweeping across. It was the Khazars with their massive military. They had the biggest mounted cavalry in the world at that time. And they prevented the Moors from taking over what was left of the Vatican lands at that time.
Isn't it interesting that a people who had the largest, most powerful cavalry at the time, and yet there's still so little known about them?
Yeah, you know that some of them became popes because they intermarried with the emperor's daughters and so on. And Pope Leo the Khazar, that was his name in the history books. He was one of the first ones. Other ones moved on through Europe. The nobility, the knighted nobility, they disappear from the scene around the 8th, 9th century. And then you have these people that they're now calling Normans popping up in the north of France, creating this brand new country. And they're no sooner there than they're creating a war. The country, Britain, was only taken over in 1066 by them, and with about 40 years they had recruited so many people there, as they had in all countries which they took over, and they took them back to the Holy Land to get Jerusalem. And they kept these crusades up for a few hundred years.
So the crusades were...
You didn't know where they were going, yeah.
So the crusades were engineered by the Khazars?
It would seem so, or these people who at least we know called themselves Normans. That is for sure. That is for sure.
Okay, let's go back to Egypt now, because you were saying that all this began when the masters in Egypt, in essence, recruited people like Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, and etc.
Yeah.
Who are those masters?
The Egyptian masters themselves always give you a story of being gods. That's traditional. Even King James, the King James Bible, made some quite profound speeches where he said that he represented God, and that was traditional. The higher nobility all claimed descendancies from God, but that's really to fix it in the people's mind that they are a different people than you. And they deserve to be above you. That's how the God thing works, you see.
So,
however, we also know that they do intensely inbreed, always have done, partially to keep the power and the wealth in their own hands, but also because they've always believed, from ancient Egypt down through Greece and onwards, that you breed for intellect, and since they thought they were the highest of the intellectual species, they bred with each other.
As a matter of fact, Queen Elizabeth is married to a distant cousin.
Yes, he is. They did. In fact, the present monarchy of England has so many fascinating stories attached to it, because really they came from Prussia and Germany. Prince Philip, his father had taken over a vacant throne that came up in Greece, and so he was Prussian really, and they took it over, and then eventually the Greeks threw them out, and he came to England. But they're all Prussian German, yeah. And what they used to be called was interesting. Even Adam Weishaupt, who popped his head up as part, and the only part, I stress, of the Illuminati. And again, revolution once again. When he went for refuge after being found out, he was kept in refuge, and two of the landed estates, the princedoms of Germany, by the Saxe and Coburgs. Now, why would royalty, that you think Adam Weishaupt was going to overthrow, why would royalty put him up, give him a lifelong pension and security? Why would royalty do that?
I don't know.
And then you find the present Queen of England, their true name is Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, the same ones.
That is their true family name?
Yes, uh-huh. Yeah.
I had never heard that. I
can check it up, uh-huh.
I did know that Queen Elizabeth, her great-grandmother is the great-grandmother of Prince Philip. I knew that, but I didn't know the family name. Say it again.
It's Saxe, which is S-A-X-E, and that was one of their princedoms for their family. Another part of the family set up another castle, so they called it Coburg, and then they set up another place, and they called that Gotha. So the family's name is Saxe, Coburg, Gotha. Yeah, that's the real name.
So
yeah,
it's the monarchy is not actually of British descent.
That's just it. When you look at the monarchy and the nobility and aristocracy of Europe, who are all descended from the Normans, none of them ever intermarried with the people they ruled over.
So how far back does this bloodline go?
They'll go back, I'm sure, to the well, actually, there's two different stories on that. Depends on who you take. I know that some of them like to believe they go back to David. You'll find that Prince Charles, in one speech he gave, he said that he could trace his lineage back to Noah. Which, of course, had to be a very high Masonic joke, because they all know what Noah means. But on the other hand, many of these German monarchs bought their monarchies around the 1700s. So it's difficult to tell if these were some of them. Yeah.
You mentioned they all know what Noah means. What does it mean?
Well, Noah is it's not really just a person, it's a system of those who come between ages. And it's to do with special inbreeding, once again, for select qualities. When you read the Old Testament version, and every Masonic lodge has that book there, you know, because it contains the rules, their rules, and the esoteric form. But you have the only reason that Noah and his family were saved, it said, was because of his he was perfect in all his generations, meaning he'd never outmarried, he'd always in-married into the same one.
Yeah, it was a bloodline perfection.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment with my guest, Alan Watt, and we're getting into what is behind the managers of ancient civilizations. What importance does it have and impact does it have upon us, if any? We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away.
You are listening to The Kevin Smith Show, the #1 talk show choice of many galaxies.
And I am glad you're listening to The Kevin Smith Show. My guest is Alan Watt. Tomorrow night, my guest, by the way, will be Robbie Thomas. He's been with us before, and this time You know, he is a psychic medium, and this time we're going to be talking about dream interpretation. So you want to be sure and join me and Robbie Thomas right here tomorrow night. Alan, how these ancient, I mean, when we talk about this being ancient, we're talking about this going back, way back into the antiquity of Egypt. Does it go back? Yeah, does it go back beyond that?
Yeah, we know that Egypt, according to the standard Egyptologists today, they'll talk about Egypt as being, you can trace it beginning around 5000 BC. But we also know that there were people moving in from the south much earlier than that. Actually, 10,000 BC, there were people moving up that way. And in fact, the Sahara Desert wasn't a desert then; it was full of jungle, and they found elephants, skeletons under the sand, and tigers, lions, etc., and even ancient stumps of trees, petrified trees.
Yeah, but so, what about this mystery system? Does it go back beyond Egypt?
Oh yeah, I mean the mysteries. When Solon, I mean we get most of it from the writings again of Plato. And Plato talked about an ancestor of his who'd left him the story of Atlantis, of course.
Okay.
And so this distant relative had gone to Egypt, maybe 120 years before Plato, and he was discussing with the high priest about how old man was, and the priest said to Solon, this relative, he said, you don't know how old you are, you Greeks. You know, he says, many, countless civilizations have risen and fallen, risen to great heights and then fallen over many, many thousands of years. So man is far, far older than we have been given with the Darwin stuff, you know, far, far older. And again, he wasn't much different than we are today. The craniums they're finding, etc., are pretty well the same size. And I think Darwin offset a lot of the historical research. He basically waylaid it to an extent by getting a philosophy across. But when you go into the histories of Greece, where they claimed that there was a catastrophe at one time on the planet, where it was possible that a huge meteorite had struck, he said that the elite lived and survived inside Mount Parnassus, and where they had food stored and water for a long time. And the same story is repeated in the histories of the Hindus, who claim they have records of 5 previous times or ages. We say ages to sort of put into figures we can understand, sort of time zones of 25,000 years or more. Actually, it's millions in the Hindu system. And then we have the likes of Tacitus, who was the royal historian for Nero, who got the Druid story, where they had a record of 3 previous ages. Now, all of them can say the same thing. Armenia is another one, where we get the biblical story of the Ark. I think it's anything to do with the Ark. That's a Masonic thing. The Ark is the sun as it goes across the sky. That's the covenant. And but you'll find that the mountain it supposedly came down on is actually full of tunnels, ancient tunnels. And the Armenians who lived at the bottom of it say that that's where the elite survived a previous catastrophe. So the Druids did the same thing in the mountains of Britain. The Greeks went into Mount Parnassus, and then the northern Indians went into the mountains of the north of India, the Brahmins. And the Brahmins there today still say that they are survivors of the previous man from a previous age. So definitely the world has gone through previous ages, which always leaves it wide open to either was it natural phenomena, or was it caused by man and advanced technology? That's always the big question, and authors make a killing at this whole speculation here.
Well,
but we do know that the Egyptians around 2000 BC had records, and the Babylonians did records where Egypt had called in all the wise men from all over, including Babylon, to reset the calendar because something had happened, and now they had a few more days added to the calendar. The old calendar was 360 days. The degrees in the circle, that's where our degree system comes from. And we had to add days to it because the Earth was now revolving slower after some kind of huge meteor hit. And we know that the huge meteors have hit in different parts of the planet. Mm-hmm. Now, if a meteor was to come down, you certainly would have tremendous heat if it was a huge one. And you would have tremendous fire as this hit the sky with almost atomic explosions. You'd have fire which would melt the pole caps, and then it would be followed by massive water collection going up into the sky, and then you'd have rain. So fire followed by water, that's part of the mystical answer to that, fire and water. Because all of those peoples gave the same story of the atmosphere went on fire, followed by tremendous rain, water.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at in my question is, do we know if this system, this mystery system that got exported through Pythagoras and Plato, etc., does it have its origins in Egypt, or did they get it somewhere else?
The Egyptians had to have gotten it from a previous time. Okay. It's no different from Sumer. Sumer did not start with some walking reptiles. It's a good story, but they had to convince the public, and this is traditional, you convince the public that they're a lesser, inferior type, and that the royalty are a superior type. They've got more of the genes of the gods. That was standard. And what they said, they always say they were offsprings of the gods. Mm-hmm. And then the public think, well, we're an inferior type made to be a slave. And if you look into the prayers of the bureaucracies, the bureaucratic classes, the priesthoods who were bureaucrats in Sumer, you find that they had prayers to the god. And the god was the invisible god, you see, of the heavens.
All right, we'll be back in about a minute, folks. It's time for our top of the hour ID break. Welcome back. My guest is Alan Watt, and we are now going to open the telephone line. If you have a question or a comment, you may call. Toll free, 1-800-289-1092. Toll free throughout North America. That's Canada and the United States, of course. 1-800-289-1092. Alan, at one point here I mentioned, and you confirmed, that in ancient times these occult managers of civilization developed one religion for the elite and another religion for the masses. Can you give us just a quick thumbnail sketch of that and why they did that?
It was to bring a slave class up, really, in the belief they were an inferior species, actually, an actual different species. And of course, you tell them that the nobility and all the aristocracy are a higher species, closer to the Godhead. That was standard all over the world, really. Right up until through Scottish and British kings and queens who believed that they were descended from the gods themselves. Now, Plato went further into the description of this, where their religion at the top was always based on a twofold type of reincarnation, which is different than the one spun out today. The religion at the top was that that they were different from the public. This is what they told each other, and Plato went through this, because in some time in the distant past, they were the rebels who rebelled against the Creator. And because they were cast here, where ordinary people already lived, they arrived with more psychic special powers than the ordinary people. And they created their own bodies from the material at hand by willing it into existence. And only a perfect body could be inhabited by their perfect spirit.
So, in effect, then, they're claiming to be what the rest of the world, the Western world, would refer to as the fallen angels under the command of Lucifer.
That's correct.
They're Luciferians.
Yeah, but you might say Luciferian.
Yeah.
And the rebels, they're proud of the term, and that they're behind all revolutions. And they claim that once they started to inbreed with the people already here, they began to lose those special powers, and hence the need to go back into the inbreeding program, which is still going on today.
Yeah, the
and
bloodline.
the priesthoods who take the genealogies.
All right, let's go to the telephone line. Caller, your first name and where are you calling from?
Hi, Kevin. This is Al from New York. I'd like to ask Alan Watt if he could give us a little more information about the tie-in with Freemasonry and Hinduism. And I was reading a book recently, or just started reading a book by David Hatcher Childress, I think, or Childress, about called The Nana Aircraft of Ancient India and Atlantis. And I was wondering if Alan would talk, if he knows anything about that, if he would talk about that going way back. Where did they get this, technology that they wrote in about the Brahmins or the caste systems?
Okay, we'll get him to comment on that. Thanks for the call. Okay.
Well, the caste system falls right into this, in effect, because in India, with the same religion of a beginning for the elite body, to do with a special type of reincarnation into perfect bodies, and only the perfect body, you'll find that modern Masonry, or what we call modern Masonry, is really, in fact, Charles Darwin, when he came out with his theory of evolution, was only on behalf of the Royal Society, that's the scientific, the Royal Chartered Scientific Society of England. He was simply brought forth to put into the public's mind what Masons had already been taught. That was their religion. Evolution was their religion, and they believed that although they themselves had been made perfect, that through the special selective breeding all done through the ages, they would become once again as the beings they had been in the beginning, these ones that were cast here, but far more perfect, with the same abilities of intellect, command, able to command people, and tremendously fantastic physical bodies. That's what Charles Darwin's theory was. It was nothing more than expanded Freemasonry. In fact, his grandfather had already put a treatise out on selective breeding and evolution before Charles did. Now look at the Charles Darwin family themselves. His great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, and himself only married into one other family, and that was the Wedgwood family of England, who were famous for their pottery, a very wealthy family, and that's the only family they ever interbred with for all those generations. Charles himself had 10 children by his wife, who was a Wedgwood, and when she died, and most of the children did die too, and 2 of them were insane, when she died, he married his mother, a Wedgwood, her sister, his aunt. So they've been going down through the ages, interbreeding for special qualities to try and keep up these special qualities. And you can jump back to Plato and say, my goodness, this is the same thing that he was talking about then, 2,300 years ago. Selective breeding for special abilities. If you want a good scientist, you get a man and a woman who are very, very good at it, and interbreed them, take their offspring, and match them up with the same over and over again. That's what we're seeing. So the Brahmins of India went into this in more detail, of course, that man was far older, and they did say, and remember that the Indian upper class is a caste class system, very much like England, by the way. I used to say, my goodness, isn't it so similar to the English system? That the Aryan people think of Germany being the Aryan race, and they got that from theosophy. But the Aryan people, whom the Brahmins are proudly descended from, were a pure white race. Again, light hair, blue eyes, etc., who came into India, some say around 500 BC. I think it was much earlier. And they lorded over different parts of India. They were told not to interbreed with the Dravidian, the darker race there. Over time they did. And you end up with this caste system. So your color literally designated your position in society, right down to the darker ones who are now called the untouchables. So you had a fixed society. The Brahmins ensured they were taught reincarnation at all levels of society and karma, so that you could train people to believe, well, that's your position in life, accept it, you must be bad in your last one to end up as an untouchable or a slave or a peasant.
And if you do very good and you behave where you are now, then you may come back in a higher caste.
That's right. Now, it is also true that they have, in the old Vedas, drawings of what appear to be aircraft. A lot has been made of it. We just don't know if this is early ancient technology.
Well, it's also in Egypt.
Yes, in Egypt too.
Yeah,
and of course, even the BBC had a documentary years ago on the lead-acid batteries that were found in Egypt, which are now in the Cairo Museum. And they have lead and copper plates in them, and the man said, watch this. He poured in the battery acid, connected two wires to a bulb, and sure enough it lit up, because this has no other function than being an electric battery. So they had electricity, and they found those batteries now in Babylon as well, or Persia, or Iraq.
Well, I'm familiar with some in Damascus, but also in Abydos, in a temple there. One of the some carvings up on the frieze show very clearly what looks like a helicopter, perhaps a jet, but certainly some type of aircraft with wings and a rudder. It also shows something that looks very much like what we would call a flying saucer, and these were carved thousands of years ago.
Yeah, well, a lot you see of deceit and deception too has crept in with sensationalism from the times of Erich von Daniken, who actually had a little guy in Mexico carve a lot of these things out for him. And a reporter from Britain found this little guy who was getting 5 pesos per piece, and that's when von Daniken hit the dust. However, he put out a lot of disinformation about the spaceships. He said, now, the thing about the flying saucers is just a globe with wings, and that's the traditional way that even...
Not in Abydos. Not in Abydos.
Well, I mean, I've seen the Vedas, and the Vedas too do more descriptions about what existed, more so than drawings. And they show, they said that the gods, now the gods, remember, were your kings, the hierarchy, they were always called gods. And they said that they fought each other in a big battle towards the end of the last age. And they could fly, they had flying machines. And they shot different colored rays or lights at each other.
Yeah.
The red one would burn anyone wearing metal, just like microwave, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we have these odd things being discussed.
Well, also now you're talking about the ancient writings there in India, in the Mahabharata.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a description of something that if I just take that description
Mm-hmm.
and show it to someone, don't tell them where it's from, don't tell them it's part of an ancient Indian epic, and they read it and I ask, what does that describe? They will say, that describes a thermonuclear blast.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that there has been found in Rajasthan a site of a thermonuclear blast in strata from 12,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And, so some of these things may be real.
Maybe real, although we know they can also be caused by very high velocity meteors coming in. It's when you get the description of them coming in.
Yeah, but it's a different type of radiation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different type of radiation and different rate of decay.
Mm-hmm.
And, there is, to date, there has been no real comment or any kind of debunking of this site.
No. Even though there are many clues still left in regular history, and it's up to the individual to decide. I mean, we can get carried away, obviously.
Sure we can.
By limited information. Limited information sells a lot of books. That's why the authors jump on it and take them off. But we do know that the ancient Greeks, who learned everything again in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
started the atomist theory, the atom theory,
Mm-hmm.
Back around 300 BC, 400 BC. And they had the atomic schools, we call them. And they're well documented, we've got records of it all. And they knew that you had tiny whirling bits of matter, and they said that the atom was not the smallest part of matter.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly we always suspected this, but just found out for sure in the 20th century. Now, it's impossible for men living thousands of years ago, I don't care how much leisure time they had, and how many slaves did all the work for them to give them this leisure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. If you didn't have the scientific knowledge and the equipment to go after what you're talking about, you could never have dreamed up the atom.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that they had the technology?
They had to have.
Uh-huh.
They had to have. There's no way a person with limited understanding of physics, no microscopes and atomic microscopes, etc., could break down the content or even dream of the content of hard matter. They understood perceptions and how they differ from angles of stance to the object and so on. But they knew that nothing was technically solid, and that if these atoms could be made to vibrate at a certain speed, you could put a man or a chair through a wall without injury. So they knew this stuff.
Now this was from 300 BC?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not so far back. I mean, at that stage of history, we dig up a lot of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and we've not, as far as I know, recovered. Archaeologists have not recovered any of this high technology for looking at atoms and so forth. Is it possible that instead of them discovering this, that they were told this, perhaps, by beings from off-world?
I don't think so. I think there have been many ages where a few come through with the knowledge and never share it with the vast majority. Power is kept by the limitation of knowledge by a few, because knowledge is power. And if it's true that they've gone through at least 5 definite and 2 possibly more ages in India, in the Indian records, then man is millions of years old. You can imagine the knowledge that was accumulated during that time.
I agree with that. But what's your take on why we haven't discovered in all these archaeological digs any of this very high technology that would have made it possible for them to understand atomic theory?
Mm-hmm. I think it's probably because it's buried so deep in specific areas that no one will get to it until it's the time to admit to it. That's how history unfolds. Suddenly, at the right time, something will be announced, something will be found.
Mm-hmm.
But what I also found very interesting was when they went after Iraq, and remembering Iraq and Iran were Greater Persia in the old system, and Babylon was there. During the whole time that Bill Clinton was in, thousands of cruise missiles were sent over. We got so used to it, it was just, nothing between our bites of food at dinner time to watch these things get shot off the ships. But these were not hitting the cities. These were going off into places in the desert where no one was. And they were just pounding the earth and blowing it all up. And some people have come forward recently and admitted these were ancient sites that hadn't even been dug up properly. So evidence is being destroyed as far as I was concerned.
Why do you think they would do that?
Because they don't want the public to know that even today, we have 3 levels of sciences today. We have from professors down. That's the lowest level of reality that we're given. And that's all supplemented and augmented by the regular magazines you buy at the stores. So we're trying to work towards this, and one day we hope to. That's the bottom level of science. Dr. Nick Begich on the CBC television in Canada,
who, by the way, will be with us next week.
Well, he's very good. He showed on the Wendy Mesler show a few years ago a whole tray full or table full of these little handheld remote-size gizmos, and he told Wendy to stand 20 feet away, and he pointed one at her and says, "What do you hear?" She says, "I hear music in the center of my head." And now he could just as easily have put words in her head.
Yeah.
He said this equipment was used by the CIA in the 1950s. Now, it had to be solid state before the public even heard of the transistor in the 60s. And he says this stuff is all obsolete. This is obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
It works within line of sight up to any distance. And I wondered how many people were locked up in hospitals for hearing voices during all this period, So that was one. So today, now the CIA are only one step up, but there's another level beyond them. There's always a trinity in the system. For the controllers wouldn't even share their higher sciences with those below them who help them, because you want to maintain power. You never share it totally. So it's been like that in all ages.
What kind of technology exists at the higher level?
I think it's probably, as I said, in ancient times, that high science to the general public appears to be magic. It's so far ahead of anything the public are told. I can remember when the BBC in the 1970s did a documentary special on Area 51 in the U.S. And they were up on a hill there looking down when it first got some attention.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to keep a team there, and they photographed these flying saucers coming out of underground hangars at that big base there, which is an American Air Force base. So the presumption is they're making them there and testing them there.
Mm-hmm.
And these things came out of the ground silently. They could go up into the air, do all kinds of odd right-angled turns. They could stop on a dime after moving at hundreds, maybe thousands of miles an hour. And they could actually stay stationary and then disappear and then appear again. Now, whether it's some sort of cloaking device or what, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many speculations about it, but that was in the 1970s. And how they deflected all of that was to bring in the disinformation characters. Oh, these things are from outer space, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So here they are coming out of the Earth here in a military base, which tells you they were making them here.
You know, I remember during Gulf War I, and you may have seen this, or you may have read about it since.
Mm-hmm.
During Gulf War I, they would do press conferences virtually every day from the war theater, from the area, and General Schwarzkopf would always make some comments to the press about how the war was progressing.
Yeah.
And there was a question, I don't remember who asked, but a question about, well, you know, what is your objective? How do you know when you've reached your objective? And he commented on that, and then they said, well, how will you do this? What is your plan? How do you plan to do this? And he said, it's simple. It's like a snake. You cut off its head, its body dies. And that's what we're going to do, and Saddam is going to have to surrender, and that's it. Then the question was, and this is where it got interesting, well, what if he does not surrender? And Schwarzkopf very quickly said, we've got things to throw at him he cannot even imagine.
Yes.
And then he said, all of this technology that all of you are so amazed at, all of these things you've been seeing, these smart bombs and missiles flying down smokestacks, is obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
We have things he cannot even imagine.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes. Oh, yeah. In fact, I've laughed at every war we've had, really, because it's to convince the public. I mean, here are soldiers going off with new uniforms, but standard equipment, really. They're still firing basically gunpowder and projectiles that have been around for 1,000 years. And they keep telling us this is the latest model. And they're so far ahead in science, they don't even have to invade a country. We know that too, because there are satellite arrays way up yonder. They can laser or bombard a whole continent if they wish to, with various types of pulsations, and knock everyone out or kill them if they wish to. So they're going through the usual, I call it the low-level routine for the bottom-level matrix people, the general population, that this is the best that we have. It's a big joke. It's a big joke. Yeah. They don't even need troops actually really anymore.
Then why do they use them?
Because they don't want us to realize how far ahead they really are. Because we're not supposed to know. If we did know exactly all that they have, we'd be absolutely petrified. We'd be petrified.
How would that affect?
How far ahead they are.
If we were all petrified, though, how would that really affect the power of those who have power?
Mm-hmm. Well, they tell a lot of us to live in fear, but it also enables them, by using such high-tech, advanced equipment, to carry out further manipulation of where they want to bring the public. The public never figure it out. They say, oh, we can't do that yet, so that's not true. That can't be happening. But in reality, yeah, they are doing things, and they have been for years, using just basic high-tech stuff on all the public. In the British newspapers, it was admitted after Gulf War I, when you saw all those soldiers coming up out of the desert, very stunned, very confused, and they were like that for 24 hours, and they admitted in the British papers they'd used electromagnetic pulse on those people. They admitted it was used, and it had tremendous effects. It also created a forms of holograms where the river appeared to be flowing backwards at one point, but they're also pounding them with basically HARP technology and scalar weaponry. And it's even in the UN Charter, and the UN has a treaty signed for the HARP technology, and all countries signed it. And in what the effects that it could do was to bombard the public with various mood-altering techniques, which would cause tremendous depression, confusion, and lethargy, etc., almost put them into a somnambulistic state. And that was used, and that was admitted in all the British papers at the time.
Well, you say there is a United Nations treaty regarding that. What does that treaty say? Does it say you can or cannot use that?
It says that countries that have signed the United Nations agreement must not be allowed to, will not use it on each other. But with all United Nations treaties that you notice, it never says that your own government cannot use it on the general public. Just like the military cannot allow, cannot use, say, hollow point bullets in warfare and people abroad, but they can use it on your public at home, and they do.
Well, you know, I have to say, I used to be a police officer, and I was not military, but we carried hollow point bullets. That's what was issued.
Yeah. And yet, if you were using that in a warfare situation with another country, that would be illegal, and you'd be in prison for it.
Well, and that explains, you know, I never knew this. After serving as a police officer here in the United States, I became an international police officer, and we worked under the administration of usually the United Nations, and we did not carry hollow points. I never understood why. I always thought maybe just an administrative decision, somebody made a purchasing decision or whatever, but it's actually that treaty, huh?
It's the treaty. That's so that every country that's signed, if there's any trouble at home, they can use more extreme weaponry on their own public. Yeah. And that's the same with the HARP. In that treaty, I think it's 1977, the HARP Treaty, it states that they have the ability, now it's been tested, and they can cause hurricanes to come in, tornadoes, they can guide tornadoes to any destination, they can cause drought or flooding, earthquake with it, and tremendous physical effects on the population, which had been played out apparently on the population of Maine. There was a lawsuit going in on behalf of them against the U.S. government for using them as guinea pigs. But over a period of time, they were using HARP to see what effects, what mood effects it would have on them. And, of course, all the information was channeled from doctors' offices, hospitals, social work departments, police, into the federal computers to collect all the data. And they found that domestic animals were turning nasty. Even cattle were charging people, their cows. The suicide rate was the highest they'd ever gone. It shot right up. And when they tried a different frequency, the people got depressed. They changed it again, and the people got very elated, and sometimes they got aggressive. So they were monitoring the psychological effects and behavior.
And this was in Maine?
Yeah.
And there's a lawsuit going on now, huh?
Yeah, it was going on a few years ago. I don't know what became of it. So you can always test on your own population, and they always have done.
All right, we have to take a break, folks. I'm learning some things tonight I didn't know. We'll be back in just a moment. My guest is Alan Watt. And welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show. My guest this evening is Alan Watt, and we are talking about, I guess you could say, a different view of history. It's easy to say a strange view because it is something that most of us perhaps have not been exposed to, at least not very deeply. And so it may seem strange to us, and yet, Alan, you have pretty well documented the stuff that you're telling us about. You've written 3 books about this.
Yeah.
What are the titles?
Well, I just call them Cutting Through, and it's because I'm cutting through this matrix that we've all been put into. And I go through 1, 2, and 3 through the ancient priesthoods and secret societies, which they had then too, to infiltrate society and spy on them, really, and direct them up to the present time, and how important they were for keeping control over vast populations, in fact, because they were international even in the days of Sumer.
Well, tell me about that. You say they were international even in the days of Sumer.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that, because that is one part of the Sumerian history that I've never been exposed to.
Yeah, well, archaeologists have documented it well that Sumer's biggest trading partner was up in India, the north of India.
Mm-hmm.
And India seemed to be the main supplier of various types of goods. Sumer's main export was wool. And they used Bahrain, the island of Bahrain, as almost a trading port where the stuff was brought from India, and that's where the priesthood sent out the merchants or their men. They had to hire the agents to do all the dealing, etc. The priesthoods dealt with the finances. On one level, they had priesthoods who wrote the laws for real estate in Sumer. That's how far ahead they were. In fact, Sumer had all of the same conveniences, you might say, of today. When it came to shopping, you could get a receipt when you shopped at the market within 15 minutes. They baked it in clay in 15 minutes. And they found millions of these.
Yeah.
So Sumer wasn't a little primitive little place. It had a very complex priesthood system, so much so, in fact, that in a book called Life Begins at Sumer, where they decipher many of the tablets that they found, even from the school children of bureaucrats. They bred the bureaucrats there, much like today. And one of them said, "I cannot look from horizon to horizon. I cannot see the horizons for government buildings." He said, "We are taxed for everything." He said, "When we bring fish in," he said, "the government officials are there to tax us. When we sell things, the government are there to tax us. When the loved ones bury their dead and put offerings on the grave, the death duties, the death taxes have to be paid to the priesthoods." It was very much like today.
Nothing much has changed, has it?
Nothing. You'd be so amazing to find out how similar it was. And they had this system pretty well all over the ancient world at that time. Later on, they found in Crete, in the Mediterranean, a huge library and a monastery. And it seemed to be almost a central priesthood who was in contact with all the different nations of that time. And many have speculated by the writings they've found that these guys were actually updating or creating the different religions of the period.
Speaking of the religions of the period, sometime later, after Sumer, in the same geographical area, you have the Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
And, you've got a priestly caste called the Magi.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
They were kingmakers. They were not just religious, they were kingmakers.
Yeah.
Now, in all of these ancient religions, and in many countries around the world today, the clergy are either the government or they are above the government.
Mm-hmm.
Here in the United States, we are champions of this separation of church and state. And by champions, I don't mean we're the only ones that have it. I just mean that's a big deal to us.
Uh-huh.
So that the religious leaders are not in control of the government. And the government is not in control of religion. At least, ostensibly, that's the way it's supposed to work.
Uh-huh.
Is it working that way?
No. No, it never did, in fact. I never did. A very high Freemason sent me a letter. I know this guy. He's in Washington, D.C., and he's listened to a lot of my talks on radio, and he said, you know, Alan, you're right, every symbol I see around this city is high Freemasonic. And when we go in, and it's mainly the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, the symbols they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go into the book by Albert Pike, who was called the Pope of Freemasonry in the 1800s,
Yeah.
he says in his own book, Morals and Dogma, the book that was given to most Freemasons up to the 32nd degree, he said, make no mistake, Freemasonry is a religion.
Mm.
And since every president of the United States becomes an honorary 33rd degree of that order, you certainly do have a religion running your country.
Now, say that again. Every president of the United States becomes honorary 33rd degree.
If they're not already, yeah. Yeah.
How do we
That's
know
why
that?
when you see George Bush Sr., the very first photo op they gave of him was with, I think, the New York Yankees, and he's wearing their pullover,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a number 33 right there, you know, on his pullover. That was, and of course I have the photographs of Ronald Reagan being given his scroll and the apron, etc., by the Scottish Rite. So that is a fact. And then if you go into the Freemasonic Encyclopedia, you have a whole list of all the presidents who've been high Freemasons.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Washington himself
yeah,
was.
I was going to say, yeah. George Washington, that's a well-established fact. George Washington was.
And that's why you've got an Egyptian obelisk, a brand new one now, for a New World Order, built to him. You only built an obelisk to a person who had achieved godhood in the mystery religion of Egypt. And that's called apotheosis. And because Washington had done such great work towards the great work, as they call it, he was raised to godhood, apotheosis. Yeah.
So they raised people to godhood in something like the same way that the Catholic Church raises people to sainthood?
Pretty well, yeah. Pretty well. Yeah. So that's what godhood means. You're raised to godhood.
Mm-hmm.
You've achieved not only the lower orders and understanding of the Philosopher's Stone and the different categories of understanding all the way up, and because of your work towards the great work, you are considered a god. And even in the famous painting you'll see there where they're around the table, and Benjamin Franklin made his speech at that table about it when he talked about Washington in a very Masonic way. Behind Washington is the rising sun right behind his head. It's all Freemasonic. Franklin himself was a member of Masonry. He wrote about it in his own newspapers. And 33 signatories signed the declaration, because you cannot, for those in the low orders, they're taught they cannot rise above the 33rd degree, because the sun, like Jesus, starts his ministry at the 30th degree east, and it's parallel, and it sets on the 33rd west. So that's why they let the lower orders think there's only 33 degrees.
How many are there really?
360.
A circle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Most of I have known a number of Masons. I do know a number of Masons.
Mm-hmm.
And the Masons that I know are people the ones I know, who have a lot of integrity, and who seem to be very patriotic, love the country,
Mm-hmm.
and love their families, and
Yep.
do a lot of things that are good public service.
Mm-hmm. But they've also sworn to obey an order by a superior and do it instantly and reserve all judgment of morality to the side.
Do you think that most of them would adhere to that?
Yeah. because there's so much comes along with Masonry. I was talking to one 32nd degree about a month ago, and he agreed after hearing a lot of my talks. He says, you know, I didn't think about it. He says, I was just a farmer, but he said I could go in to see a bank manager with no collateral down and ask for a bank loan, and I could pick it up in the afternoon. The average person couldn't do that. So you get a lot of fringe benefits. You get off with a lot of speeding tickets, and you can get a bed in the hospital much quicker than anyone else. So there's a lot more to it. In fact, and also if you start a business off in a town and you join the lodge, they're all sworn to give you business to bring custom your way. And so the little guy with the hardware store up the road there who's not a Mason will be scratching his head wondering why no one's coming in his door.
Wow, now that's amazing. Amazing. We're going to continue with that in just a moment. And you're back on the Kevin Smith Show. We're talking to Alan Watt, and let's go to the telephone line. Caller, if you will, tell us your first name and where are you calling from?
Hi, Kevin. It's Al again. I have a question for Alan. If Ronald Reagan was a 33-degree Mason, he gave a speech, I believe, at the United Nations, and I think he was making some kind of a comment that if we were invaded, or it would bring the nations together. Maybe comment was geared towards UFOs. What do you think? You think we're that far off from the visitation? Kevin had a guest on last night, I think it was Tom Horn, that was speculating towards a possible something happening in the imminent future where we might see something happening in the skies. So I guess that's my... How far do you think that we might get some kind of a visitation, if any?
Okay, were you able to hear that, Alan?
I think so.
I'll hang up, Kevin.
Okay, Al, thanks for the call.
It should be prefaced, the answer should be prefaced in two parts, really. Number one, they had meetings in the early 1900s about the possibility of using a threat from outer space to bring the whole world together under a new type of government. The first man to express this was John Dewey. He made this. He mentioned this in speeches, that if they could possibly convince the public of an attack from outer space, we could all band together, give up our nationalism, which they wanted to destroy, of course, and bring us all together. This was repeated by many presidents, including Ronald Reagan. He made a few speeches like this. Yeah. That if only there was attack from outer space, we would all band together as one. I think this maybe H.G. Wells wrote a book about it, War of the Worlds. That was the same. And H.G. Wells worked for the British government. He was a propagandist for the Secret Service, and that has been declassified in Britain. So you have the same sort of agenda they're convincing the public, because the whole idea for a new world order, which is the United Nations' whole goal, is to get us to give up our nationalism and fight against something. Now they can create holograms in the air. I've seen one already myself a few years ago, and with a witness with me. It was a definite hologram. And
how do you know it was a hologram?
Because it started off with what appeared to be the Northern Lights, and the Northern Lights generally, they fly all over the sky at tremendous speeds, and this thing formed into an image right above me of a figure with wings. And I thought, what on earth are they trying to make here? And I know that the HARP facility has admitted they can make holograms by manipulating the ionosphere. So I watched this for 20 minutes, and then 2 nights later a guy phoned Art Bell in Ontario, and he said the same thing, as I saw something in the sky being formed. And Art Bell, who's had everybody on, including so many guys who claim that they are Satan themselves. Cut him off, and he says, what nonsense. I could never figure that one out, you know. I wouldn't let the man speak because I saw the same thing. The person with me saw the same thing. So don't always believe what you see. There are very high technological powers at play right now to convince us of something else happening in order to change our whole way of living. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. It's been written about, documented from major speeches, and we should take it seriously. We shouldn't fall for what they want us to believe right out the back, you know.
What's interesting to me, listening to you, is that you're referencing things in support of what you say. You're referencing documents that are in the public domain that people can go get their hands on it and read it. What's interesting to me is that these, for lack of a better word, power brokers or the elite or whatever seem to be out in the open with what they're doing. It's not really a conspiracy, is it?
Well, I can document on something else, and this is what people should look into. It was the first fund put up by a major multi-millionaire, probably a billionaire at the time even, and that was Baron Rothschild in England in the 1800s. And he wanted to finance writers, novelists, to write along certain lines of science fiction, to prepare the minds of the young who would be excited with these stories so that they could bring in scientific investigation using space rocketry, etc., in the following century, and the young would think it was all a natural direction in which to go. That was called predictive programming. And they hired thousands of novelists right up into the 1900s. Arthur C. Clarke was one of them. Hainan was another one that started the whole Mount Shasta thing off for the New Age. He wrote a novel about it, a fictional novel. Now they go there and worship. And Arthur C. Clarke wrote the biggest occultic movie ever done, 2001, for the High Freemasons. And the New World Order was to kick off in 2001, and he wrote the book in the 1960s, and that's when they made the movie. It was to be completed by 2010, and that was the second movie. That was all an occultic story, those two stories. That had nothing to do with space, if you understand the esoteric symbolism.
Well, even the Council for Foreign Relations publishes amazing statements and amazing speeches about their plans for the future.
Yeah.
And that's why, I hear a lot of people talk about conspiracies, but if you're out in the open, that's not much of a conspiracy.
H.G. Wells, who was one of their main propagandists and writers for the British Secret Service and a founder of the Fabian Society, which is just another branch of the CFR, Royal Institute of International Affairs, because they run both sides of everything. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, and non-fiction.
Yeah.
And he said, yes, we are creating a new world order under a world government. He says the documentation we have put out for the public, it's in libraries. He says it's an open conspiracy. He says we tell them what we want to do, where we're taking them, and they don't want to read it. But the book is still out there.
Yeah. Alan, we're out of time. Listen, I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. It's been fascinating. I appreciate you being here.
It's a pleasure.
Tell us quickly your web address.
It's cuttingthroughthematrix.com.
And is that where
my name is Alan Watt.
Yeah, and Alan, is that where we can get your books?
Yes,
Okay. Again, thanks for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. And I hope you'll make it a habit to come back again each and every night. I'll be back here again tomorrow night. I hope you will be too. My guest tomorrow night is going to be Robbie Thomas. We're going to be talking about dream interpretation. Had any strange dreams? Tomorrow night's the night to call in. My friends call me Steel Eye, my enemies do too. You call me whatever you like. Just keep coming back. See you tomorrow night. So long, everybody.
show on Global Star Communications Network.
And good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be all around the earth, whoever you happen to be. Thanks for joining us here at the Kevin Smith Show. If it's your very first time to listen to the show, a special welcome to you. I'm delighted you're here, and I hope you make a habit out of this. It's a good habit to get into. It really, really is. We get email, lots of email, and I really enjoy reading it. I'm not joking, folks. I'm telling you the truth. I read all of the email that comes in. I respond to as much of it as I can, and I want you to know that I do appreciate it. I do find it very interesting and stimulating and sometimes very educating. And I want to give you our email address. Some of you know, and you write to me frequently. That's a good thing. Some of you don't know our email address, and I want to give it to you. It is host@kevinsmithshow.com, and in the subject line put the words listener comment, okay? And if you forget all of that, look, the easy way to do it, go over to the website, kevinsmithshow.com. And when you're there on the website, just click where it says Contact Us, and it'll bring up a page. It'll take care of all of the addressing and everything for you, okay? So send me an email. Let me know that you're listening and what you think. You like it, you don't like it, you want someone specific to be invited to be a guest. I do pay attention to those. And many of you know that you have suggested guests, and that, I can't get them like tomorrow because there's some scheduling to work out with them, but we do get them. My guest tonight, as a matter of fact, is someone who was suggested to me by one of you, our listeners. So send me that email, okay? While you're over there at the Kevin Smith Show website, be sure, if you have not already subscribed to the K-Files e-zine, that's our free weekly newsletter. Be sure you do that. It's free and only takes about 20 seconds to subscribe, and then you will not be the only person who does not know. That's a good thing, huh? All right. My guest tonight is going to be Alan Watt. Alan Watt has questioned standard versions of history and has delved into ancient civilizations and the occult groups which managed them. Since 1998, Alan has come forward to share his knowledge, beginning with the Sweet Liberty radio program on international shortwave. This shortwave broadcast ended in 2005, but he continues broadcasting on First Amendment Internet Radio every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And he's going to join us here in just a couple of minutes after we come back from our first break. And we're going to be talking with him tonight about the influence of these occult groups from ancient times. We'll be talking about how they managed the ancient civilizations and to what end, and what impact perhaps that has in our day and upon our lives. Again, that's Alan Watt, and he's got a website called Cutting Through the Matrix, and you want to be sure and check that out as well, okay? So go on over to kevinsmithshow.com and sign up for the K-Files e-zine and send me an email too. By the way, while you're there, sign our guest book. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Kevin Smith Show. My guest this evening, as I told you, is Alan Watt. And Alan has just finished. I want to tell you, I really appreciate what he's doing. He has just finished another interview and went right straight from that here to talk with you. So, Alan, thank you and welcome to the Kevin Smith Show.
It's a pleasure.
Alan, you have kind of a... I don't want to say it's a strange view of the world. It's not that it's strange, but it's that you have a view that is different from the mainstream, and it's quite a bit different. And one of the things that I noticed, I listened to an interview that you had on Coast to Coast, and one of the things that I noticed is that, you know, this thought came to my mind. You can be in a situation where, and people certainly have been in a situation like this in various places around the world, where you don't see anything, but and maybe you don't smell anything, but all of a sudden your body begins to react to something that's in the air, poison gas, for instance. And so, you know, at first you start saying, well, you know, I can't see, my vision is blurred, and then, well, I feel funny, and then, you know, but still you don't see and you don't smell anything, you didn't hear anything, but it starts to have an effect on you. And a lot of people around the world right now are sort of in that situation. They really don't see something, and they haven't heard, and they don't smell anything, but lots of people are beginning to sense something's up.
Oh, yes.
And
yeah, something definitely is up. It's almost a hush before the storm. There's a hush of expectation. And there's been such a hype, mind you, of I call it terror creation in the people's minds to get them into something so that they will react and go the way they're planned to go. That's generally why fear and terror is used from the top down. That's a standard down through the ages. It brings into mind, actually, Professor Carroll Quigley, who was the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. And he was in the record-keeping department, or histories, and he was updating and training them in a new way of living. You might call it a new world order of the time. And train them up to revolutionaries, and also to enter governments and take over those governments, and then take a particular agenda forward, which was to create wars upon other countries and take them over one by one into world empire.
Well, who was behind that? I mean, you've got Socrates and Pythagoras and Plato and all those guys being sent to these to study these mysteries. Who is behind it? Who sent them?
They were sent by the masters back in Egypt. Egypt exported revolution. That's what exported. And all the ones who came there to be initiated were being trained to go back to their former countries, set up these schools in preparation for revolution. And Plato wrote about it. And Plato actually was chased off too. He disappeared for years after his teacher Socrates had to drink the hemlock. And so he disappeared and eventually came back and repented and started up his school, but he was no sooner there than he was starting the same old thing all over again. And Plato wrote the book called The Republic.
Right.
And The Republic, of course, was about a future utopia to come. A utopia where an intelligentsia, they called it a natural aristocracy, would rule. Almost a scientific system, but at the top of them would be the guardians, a guardian class, the guardians of the world, and the guardians of the system. And Plato said, you know, man is infinitely malleable. He can adapt to anything so quickly, and because of that ability, man could be made to adapt to a series of adaptations leading to a perfect new type of creature. And he said we already have domesticated animals for thousands of years. And if we want a small domesticated dog, he says, we create one by selective breeding. If we want the same thing to be a big dog, we again select the dogs, interbreed them until we get the perfect dog. He said humans are the same. We can do the same with humans and create really tall, long ones if we wanted people to pick apples, or short, not too bright ones who wouldn't, because we don't want people to rebel, of course. So it makes short ones for mining and doing all the heavy work and labor. And when you realize what he was talking about was a science that he was not inventing or discovering, he was simply repeating what they already knew in Egypt for thousands of years and had been doing.
What's interesting about what you're saying here is that it sounds very much like what the ancient Sumerians said about the Anunnaki. Are you familiar with that?
Not really. The Anunnaki has nothing to do with what people have recently been flooded with.
Well, what they said was the Anunnaki did genetic engineering for the purpose of creating a race to do occult managers.
Oh, yeah.
And can you kind of take us back in time and give us a little bit of a history lesson about that? What do you mean when you say that they were managed by these occult people?
Well, I think the masters of it, who left more records of the techniques, were the Egyptians and the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And Egypt took every pharaoh, for instance, and trained him in the art of government, the sciences of government, they called it, and to the mysteries of government. These were the hidden sciences of basically human mass psychology. And interestingly enough, later the Greek nobility, such as Plato and Democritus and all the big boys, Socrates, Pythagoras, they all were sent to Egypt to enter the mysteries. It would take them 22 years there generally to learn all the mysteries. And then they were sent back to their own countries. Sometimes they had to move on. Plato went to the mysteries there. He was then sent to the mystery school in Palestine, and then to one in India, and then back to Greece. So this is a lot of learning.
And what was the purpose for that?
Well, what they learned, when you look at what came out of Egypt, was revolution. Because from the days of even Pythagoras, who studied there, and he was sent back to the Grecian colonies. Now, they had a big empire at that time, and he was sent to Crotona, where he set up a mystery school, the standard mystery school. These mystery schools had so much in common with the later Catholic monasteries. It's quite amazing. Because, and you see it 2,000 years ago in Palestine, where the Essenes were. They're all the same, really, with their techniques. Pythagoras would recruit young aristocratic students. He actually took in male and female, separate quarters, of course, but they had 5 years of silence. That was standard. And they watch, look, and listen. And eventually some of them were picked to go higher. Some of the young ladies were trained in with a tremendous education to be good marriageable partners for the nobility. And then they were basically taken out and introduced to higher members of the existing powers, existing establishments. And the whole idea was to start swaying decisions made in those governments. And when this was found out, what it was really all about, a form of revolution, they turned on Pythagoras and burned down his school and chased him off, and it's undecided whether he was killed or not. But that was the same thing that happened ultimately to Socrates. Now, Socrates, who'd also been trained in Egypt and said a lot of wise things, as they all have very wise sayings, he was accused of corrupting the youth. And what they really meant was he was doing the same thing as Pythagoras. He was recruiting young nobility histories for them and filing them. And from that, he wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment. And he talks about how the Council on Foreign Relations, the British set, in British Commonwealth countries, they're called Institutes of International Affairs. And every Commonwealth country, including Canada, has one. Non-Commonwealth countries have Council on Foreign Relations. India has one too, and Pakistan. And he talks about how the government hyped up the British public for 3 or 4 years prior to World War II to get them all sort of ready for the war. And they had board meetings with the big newspaper corporations of London, who were all members of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they agreed to panic the people by putting out false data, propaganda, on an increasing drumbeat right up for 2 or 3 years on the go. And they told them nothing but lies. And Quigley, who has the records, talks about this being discussed at the round tables in London with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and they agreed to constantly tell the people in all the newspapers that Hitler had all this gas ready to gas everybody in Britain. And they had, millions of tons of it. And sure enough, they gave everybody a gas mask, and children had them, and they had practice rehearsals in school and putting them on, something like it did during the Cold War. Children get under the table. It was to keep it fresh in your memory. And then of course they even asked King George to make a speech to the public, to tell them to start digging trenches in major cities. This is so it would seem more visual to them. The trenches would be of no use at all, of course, in an air raid. But they kept up this hype and fear, and they even started evacuating children up into Scotland from the major cities. And again, at that time, the war was still 3 years away, and it split the families up and made it seem all so real, so that by the time, with all this hype, you're going to get gassed at any minute, when they eventually said we're going to war with Germany, the people who were so tensed up and panicked breathed a sigh of relief.
Yeah,
and that is how psychological warfare works on entire populations.
This isn't something new, though, is it?
Pardon?
This is not something new, though, is it?
It's a standard technique.
Been going on, actually, for millennia.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, that's something that I really was interested in as I was listening to your interview. And also, I went to your website and I read some things you have on your website. It's called Cutting Through the Matrix, right?
Mm-hmm.
CuttingThroughTheMatrix.com. But what really kind of piqued my interest was the fact that this is not new. It's been going on for millennia. And you talk about how the ancient civilizations were manipulated by